Good morning, everyone. Idamik Skanatani. Welcome to Real Dads with Brad Moser and my honored guest today, Dr. Leroy Littlebear. Welcome, Leroy. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored to be on your show.
The title of today's show is What Can Parents Do for Truth and Reconciliation? We are here joined on Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022. We're on Jess FM, live on jessfm.ca. If you're on Roku TV, you can check us out at SSH101. And also, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. Before we begin, I'm just going to make a land acknowledgement. So Leroy and myself are situated in Lethbridge, Alberta. In honor and acknowledgement of Treaty 7 territory, including the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nations, Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. We appreciate and respect the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps marked these lands for generations. Welcome, Leroy. And I just want to give a nice introduction to Leroy. It's great to have him on the show today. Leroy is a distinguished Niitsitapi scholar and also works within Indigenous Studies at the University of Lethbridge. His other position at the university is Special Advisor to the President. It's great to have Leroy on the show, as I mentioned. This is very important right now because as of last year, we've all heard about the disturbing news coming out of the discovery of thousands of unmarked graves outside of former residential schools. Non-Indigenous people across Canada are now informed of the horrors of Indian residential schools, and of which Indigenous people across Canada are already aware of this. And the effects of intergenerational trauma and the longstanding impacts on your people, communities, and culture. We all know now that truth and reconciliation is an important thing. And I just wanted to have Leroy here to join us today to talk about this. So the first question for you, Leroy, is what do you find is most important for all of us to know now when it comes to truth and reconciliation?
I would say that it is a good idea for people to try and dig into the history of Canada. Most of us don't really know the true history of this country. And a lot of us have short memories. And I think part of that is due to the fact that we, in Western society, we're so forward-looking. In other words, we're talking always about the future. And we don't often look back because of our notions of time. It's kind of like when I'm talking about notions of time, It's kind of like, if you could use as an analogy, standing by a river, and the river is flowing past you, and we're always looking upstream. See, we never turn around and look downstream. And so most of us don't pay much attention to the past, and to draw on the past for what we do today. And so that's what I mean. We should take lessons from the past, look over our shoulder and, learn from the past. And most of us don't know that history. And we should really learn about that history. And to a large extent, we start to play, when we know a little bit about it, a lot of us want to stay away from it and play games of denial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So important to mention. I appreciate what you saying that, Leroy, that we are constantly looking upstream in society, and so it's important to look downstream, the past, and be aware of it, not be wrapped up in denial, and learn from the past.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something that's happening now is with the great thing now. I mean, this is something personally, when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, obviously there is no knowledge, no history provided in school about what was happening in residential schools and what did happen in the past. But now I'm grateful that children as young as kindergarten, grade 1 are learning this information. My children knew a lot about it before I even told them about it, and this is amazing. Right? I
Right.
appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, let me give you, and I've repeated this many, many times to different audiences. Let me give you my kind of like these versions and so on, what I've been telling other audiences. See, you see, if I were to take you, and as I tell audiences, let me speed up the video. Okay. If we were to go back to 350 AD, 350 AD, there was a time when we've all heard about a famous person by the name of Saint Augustine. Okay. Well, the way I tell it, and half jokingly, I say Saint Augustine was having insomnia. And what he was having insomnia about was these infidels, and by infidels, we mean non-Christians that were kind of coming into invading what we now refer to as the Middle East or the Holy Lands. Okay. And he was wondering, how can we deal with this situation? And in his insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night, as I half jokingly say, he takes out his iPad to conduct holy war, but he wrote that note to himself. It is not a sin to conduct holy wars against infidels. In other words, non-Christians. And he put his note away and finally went to sleep. Well, about 1050 AD, in other words, 700 years later, the Pope of the day discovered the hard drive of St. Augustine that said it is not a sin to conduct holy wars against infidels, guess what happened? Crusades started to happen. The Crusades were holy wars, jihads, okay? And in Europe, they were, you know, there was the inquisitions and so on. And if you speed up the video, when Columbus came to the Americas, I could see him saying, "Oh no, do we have to do this again?" In other words, he runs into infidels, non-Christians, see? And the Spanish, who were strong Catholics, had a practice that was called requerimiento, which meant that practice was they used to go out in the jungles of the Central and South America, and they would make these public announcements that said, that were announcements to the Indians, as though the Indians understood Spanish, for the Indians to come and surrender to them. And if they didn't, that it was cause for the Spanish to go out and hunt them down. See? Well, you could begin to see the basis for the kind of beliefs around indigenous people. See, when the people came. Now, from an academic point of view, it was in the about 700 years ago was the Enlightenment Era, which I refer to as the Age of Reason. And it was at that time, even though the ideas and concepts around the Enlightenment Era were not new, but they kind of coalesced at that time. And they were kind of a philosophical, political rebellion against the divine rule of kings, against the church, because the church and the monarchs had the libraries, they were educated, they knew how to write and so on, but the commoners didn't know that, didn't have access to this, but they said, we don't need those books and know-how. We can come to know things through pure reason. See, and that was the rebellion against the church and the kings and queens. See, and so the Age of Reason was in full bloom when the Americas were being colonized and so on. And they were, so because the belief system, the cultures of our people were very different from those that arose out of the Age of Reason, where measurement in science was the order of the day. Anything that couldn't be measured was not subject to measurement. Hey, was not scientific. See, well, the thing was, all of these things, said, hey, these native people over here don't know anything, because our science was very differently based. see. And so that's the reason why native knowledge was pushed aside, and the whole notion of scientific methodologies and so on were the order of the day here. But now, just as of late, people are saying, oh, maybe there's some truth to those that native knowledge and so on. Saying people are just now starting to discover those truth and that knowledge base that native people have. So that's what I mean by, if we were to dig a little bit into the past, you begin to discover all these historical basis for the for why things turned out to be the way they are, and why, for instance, residential schools came into existence, which should have never been the case in the first place.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I appreciate I appreciate you. And so I mentioned before we started here, Leroy, that this is 18 years ago, and I'm dating myself, and I know I'm dating you, Leroy. But I took a course with Leroy. He was a professor in Native American Studies. I took a course with him, and I really appreciated your style of teaching and how you tell really good stories. I mean stories in the literal sense, and you're very good at that. And I appreciate just now hearing about, I didn't know about all this information from the past, way going back to 350 AD, about how that was all connected to, the scientific method, age of reason, and how, that especially when, when Columbus came to North America, and just how there was a push away from how natives saw things and stuff like that. That just kind of blew my mind just now.
Yeah. See, here in Canada, let me give you a little bit of a history about Canada. See, when the United States broke away from the British in 1776, I think it was, they came rushing westward. They started to rush westward and so on. And when they were rushing westward, eventually they wanted to build a railroad. And I jokingly say there was in California, there was a big, big sign that says $1.49 days sales sign, and everybody rushed westward for that sale. Okay. While they were rushing westward, some of them started to come up into what is now southern Alberta. Okay, right where we live today, right here in southern Alberta. Well, Canada, with our first prime minister, John A. Macdonald, who was an alcoholic, closet alcoholic. Okay. And one of his drunken stupors did say, hey, those Americans are starting to come across the border. We need to push them back across the line. So he quickly formed the Northwest Mounted Police. And so they pushed them across. And he says, hey, we need to get our people to go and settle the Canadian prairies and so on. Because, see, in international law, you have to occupy the territory. You cannot just claim a territory, you also have to occupy it. So we needed Canadians to occupy the territory, see. So when they came westward, and the notion of building a railroad on the American side, Canadians said, hey, we need to build a railroad on the Canadian side too. So that's the reason why westward to get British Columbia to join Confederation, you know, so that we can build a railroad too on this side. So, and in the rush, they said, oh, geez, we forgot those Indians are in the way. We need to get peaceful passage through their territory. You know, let's sign treaties with them. So it was kind of almost an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reason why they did it so quickly. Treaty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Mm-hmm.
7, just raced westward, you know, to sign those treaties so that there's peaceful passage for the building of a railroad westward.
Mm-hmm.
See? And in the process, that's where the idea was, hey, by keeping those Indians out of the way, hey, so that they're not big game hunters, we need to get them to be farmers. And the best way to get them to be farmers is to educate them in those ways. That's where the residential school notions came up. See? But along with that came the introduction of diseases. And that's where those unmarked graves comes from. The church, some of them, in other words, think about COVID-19. Well, what might have it been like back then when there wasn't as good of medicines and so on? They didn't know how to handle it. So let's just have mass graves and so on, you know. So that's where those graves comes from. Yeah.
Wow. That is fascinating. This is really great. I appreciate this history lesson. I'm learning so much. Absolutely not thinking about the residential school. I mean, thinking about it, but not knowing where that actually came from, where it stemmed from is, yeah. Again, it blows my mind.
Yeah, it's all related to that history and so on. And a large part of it is reaction on the part of Canada to the United States. You know, what was happening on the other side? It was a reaction to that. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, this is really interesting, and I'm just kind of now realizing how much I've been looking for, like as you said, Leroy, that we're such a forward-facing society upstream that I've been doing that for so long, and I really need to myself look downstream and really understand Canada's rich history. And knowledge is power. That helps us, I think, move forward, is knowing this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So this is great. Let's going back to what we're the topic for today of what can parents do for truth and reconciliation. I think a big part of this is really learning the truth and learning the history of how this all came to be and educating our children on it.
Yeah. Well, I think to a large extent, our school systems in the past, like I said, sometimes people kind of play a game of denial. They don't want to face, because when we're talking about truth and reconciliation, it is most people talked about reconciliation, but not the truth. See? And so the truth has to also be told in order to bring about true reconciliation. And the example I give, the analogy I refer to, is kind of like a marital situation where a man and a wife, for instance, have problems and they decide to split up. Okay. And then maybe sometime a little bit later, they decide to try again, come back together. And if they just simply come back together and take off from where they left off before, they might say sorry to each other and so forth. That would be what I would refer to as reconciliation. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But in order for that partnership, for that marriage to really work, they would have to stop and say, what is it that's causing us to, have these marital problems and that caused us to split in the first place? Let's look at that and let's do something about it. See, because if they don't, you can be sure they'll split apart again further down the road. See? So looking deeply at the problem that's really causing that situation is looking at the truth. See? And so when we're talking truth and reconciliation, that's what we have to do as a society, as a country,
Yeah.
Because most of us are, are only talking reconciliation, but not really talking the truth.
Yes.
So in our schools, I think teaching our kids that history and so on, we'll learn lessons from that. We will and our kids will learn good lessons on both sides. Good relationships will develop in the long run. Yeah. And people will get along.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. And I think that's a huge part of that and that's such a good lesson for everybody here. Everybody listening, Leroy, is the importance of truth and not getting into that avoidance trap of really being aware and looking back in the past of what has happened and how it's led to where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I think with as in the role of parents, now that I'm motivated to do this as well and to continue doing this, is to talk to my children about the truth and also understanding from them, learning what they've learned in school about residential schools, and to be aware of that and to talk about it, and talk about the lessons that we have, like you said, coming from that, and how knowing that truth can enable us to make better decisions now and in the future.
Right. Yeah. So that these kind of situations don't happen again and so on in the future.
Yeah.
And see, I don't know if you've ever read any of John Ralston Saul's writings. John Ralston Saul is the hubby of one of our former governor generals. And he says, John Ralston Saul says, most of us, in Canada, for instance, kind of have an ID problem. And that ID problem arises why? Because as long as we've been here, that is, Euro-Canadians have been here, we still trace our ancestry to Europe rather than to here, see. And the two main pillars in Canada are French and English. We've never added that third pillar, which is the Indigenous pillar. If we add that Indigenous pillar, we would have a society that's very unique. See, very unique, and that doesn't exist anywhere else. We would have an identity that's very unique. See, we should take advantage of that. And the example I give is, what if you had somebody that's lived here in Lethbridge who originally was from Portland, Oregon, but has lived here in Lethbridge for 50 years? And you ask the guy after 50 years, where are you from? And he says, Portland, Oregon. You can begin to see that he's never identified with Lethbridge. See, in other words, all along, he's considered himself an outsider. See, and that's kind of the situation we as Canadians have. And that's what John Ralston Saul was talking about. See, we're still using those Euro-Canadian, those Euro roots as our source of identity, rather than using, Canada and this land as our source of identity.
Yeah, and I think that when you're saying there, and I haven't read about the work of John Ralston Saul. I was definitely interested in doing that. But I remember what you mentioned there about the Indigenous pillar, like having that as a part of our culture. I think would be mainstream culture would just be, it would add so much richness and diversity to it, right? If there was more knowledge about the Blackfoot language here in Southern Alberta, if there is more knowledge about Indigenous cultural practices, such as sweat lodges, the prayer and the smudges and the food and everything. I think that would add so much to our culture. Overall.
Right. Yeah. Those are, if you're on me too, I can go into identity in a very deep sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm wondering if just going back to what we're talking about with people overall, but parents as well, trying to really come to terms with the truth of our history with Indigenous peoples and the reconciliation part. Any other ideas on how we can do that, both the truth and the reconciliation part?
Well, I think one of the ways we can do that is to learn a little bit about the laws and things like treaties. Like, for instance, do our schools teach about treaties? What are those treaties about? They give you a good history about Canada. And for instance, things like Indian Act and so forth, And there's also a number of things that most people, have, false information about indigenous people. For instance, a lot of people, when we're talking about the Indian Act, for instance, a lot of people believe Indians don't pay taxes. Okay. Well, geez, you know, I pay taxes like anybody else, you know, and they believe Indians are tax burdens and so forth. Well, let me tell you, there's only one tax exemption for Indians. There's only one tax exemption, and that is if you live on a reserve and earn money on a reserve, you don't pay taxes. That's the only exemption. Now, you take a corporation, and if you go through the tax regulations, boy, do they have a bunch of tax exemptions for corporations.
Mhm.
So it should be those corporations we're complaining, we should
Yes.
complain about that
Mhm.
don't pay taxes. In other words, our tax system is in fact corporate welfare. That's what we've got, is corporate welfare, you know. And the Indians only have one tax exemption, and that is if you live on a reserve and make income on a reserve, you don't pay tax. That's the only one. Everything else is taxable. See, so those those kind of information and so forth are things that, in other words, getting the right information to a large extent will bring about truth and reconciliation. See, and so by teaching about treaty, teaching about things like the Indian Act in our schools, that's where you get the right information as opposed to getting it from Joe Blow on the street that doesn't, they just hear it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
incorrect info and so on.
Yes.
See,
Yeah, and that's such a big thing now with all the fake news that you hear about on whatever social media and everything, and we really need to look at what was, instead of all the gossip and everything, we need to look at what is the real history, what is the real truth,
yeah,
right, of our past and whatnot, um, and I like what you're saying there about we can hear all these rumors of the gossip or develop our own beliefs. Here in Lethbridge, people might see, they might see Indigenous people on the street, and they're only seeing a few of them, and they think that this is all natives are and everything, and oh, it's because of the tax exemption or whatever the theory might be. But you're not really looking at the truth. You're not looking at the colonization. You're not looking at the intergenerational trauma caused by residential schools, and understanding that people who are saying that we're on your land and everything else, right? There's so much that's not being looked at.
yeah, yeah. So it's kind of like doing a little bit of homework, to getting the right information and so on. And to me, it starts in the schools, educating our people and so on, so that they grow up with the truth and so on. Say,
Mm-hmm.
our students, etc., they've got the right information and so on.
Right.
And otherwise, hey, they they hear these things and so on
Mm-hmm.
when it's all misinformation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just want to add something, Leroy, and I want to hear your opinion on it. But I think the truth is definitely understated, but it's very important. The reconciliation part, I think, is more of maybe just, I think it takes courage, right? You know the truth, but it takes courage to follow through and act with respect and integrity, and standing up for other people who are being treated fairly, that kind of thing, and just to really do the work that's hard, but is important to make things better. Does
Right.
that sound about right? Maybe what
Oh,
your
yeah,
thoughts? Yeah.
very much so.
Mhm.
That's where the work is hard to do, and that's where sometimes the games of denial come up and so on. And because sometimes it begins to mean we have to undo and uncover some maybe not so good news from the past and so on.
Mhm.
And government policy, for instance, to a large extent, they were because in Canadian law, the federal government had jurisdiction over Indians. Okay. Well, they didn't, rather than kind of taking that responsibility on, when it came to education, for instance, what they did was they simply took that educational responsibility and turned around and gave it to somebody else, in this case, the churches and so on, and said, hey, I'll give you those resources. You guys educate these Indians. See? And they didn't do a very good job of overseeing what the churches were doing. See?
Mhm.
And now we're just uncovering what the churches are dead,
Right.
because
Mhm.
they didn't have the, in fact, they probably didn't give them very good resources. And the churches probably had their hands tied, I don't know, saying, geez, I don't know what to do with all these sick children. There's no hospitals around, there's no doctors. What do I do with them? See? And so we end up with all these mass graves and so on. See? So the federal government didn't do a very good job of overseeing, and so they kind of abdicated their responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah. This has been a wonderful experience, Leroy. The time just flew by. I appreciate all the history that you've taught me and all the listeners today. And I appreciate also that you made it interesting and even entertaining a bit of sense of humor as well came out, and I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we do have to kind of wrap things up here, but it's been a wonderful program today. We're joined here again by Dr. Leroy Littlebear. And for the show today, what can parents do for truth and reconciliation? Is there anything else you wanted to mention, Leroy, about this topic before we head out?
Well, I would say the Truth and Reconciliation Report is out. It's been out for a few years. The um, the challenges are there, and I would say to people, hey, read those. You will find a lot of the information that we've been talking about. And do read. Hey, read John Ralston Saul. Do read some of the Canadian history, and you will get the right information. I used to use a book called Letters to Vanessa in my in one of my classes, and the message behind Letters to Vanessa was a father writing these letters to his daughter who was going to university. And the message he was giving to his daughter was, don't believe everything they teach you. You go and find out for yourself. You know, Find out for yourself. Don't believe everything they teach you. Here's what they're going to tell you in these courses, in these classes. But don't believe everything they tell you. You go and find out for yourself. So that would be the same message I would give to parents and to teachers.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much. And again, the importance of learning from the lessons from the past and looking downstream to understand where we are now and going into the future.
Yeah.
So
Thank
important.
you very much for having me on your show.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leroy Littlebear. It's been great. And yes, thank you everybody for joining us. And for as for Real Dads with Brad Moser, check me out. I'll be having a show at the end of the month. So we'll see you then.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leroy. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.